American Spirits, episode 28. Continue. Mencken. This is part two of our review of his historical essays. And of course, I've got Mr. Ryan Turnipseed with me as usual, co-hosting the stream. How are you doing?
I'm doing pretty well. How are you doing?
Good. Been streaming Warhammer earlier on my gaming channel. Actually, on that note, Mr. Auberon Quinn was streaming with us as well a couple days ago on this channel. Actually, how are you doing?
Oh, I've had such a trying day trying to coach some inveterate novice on the finer points of the art.
Yeah, that is true. You were in my group chat or not my live chat teaching me how to play, so that was very much appreciated. So yeah, we've been wanting to do some gaming streams for a while, and a lot of us have actually been playing Warhammer 3, Total War Warhammer 3 already. I'm new to it, so I kind of hopped in along with our president Red Hawk. So tune into that. Well, it'll probably be fairly regular, doing some Warhammer gaming streaming. Figure, since the guys are playing anyway, we might as well just
monetize it.
Yes, we might as well monetize it. And so I've kind of got a weird setup, but also, the Nathaniel Green guys have been streaming some Halo sometimes on Fridays, so we're kind of doing that now. Anyway, let's get started with the stream. I feel like our viewer count is really low. Do we really only have
Really
6
low.
watching? Is something wrong? I'll just make sure the audio is good on the stream, and yeah, no, I'm audible. Okay, maybe it's just because people are off today and from the holiday, but we'll continue on as normal. It seems to be
This
working
is not
fine.
the stream to miss.
No, so yeah, so odd. Anyway, we're starting with the Greeks, the essay, the Greeks. Let me make sure I pull it up onto the screen here. There we go. All right, who wants to start with the first essay?
I can. So this essay was first published 1927, and this will be some fun counter narrative for, I think, what even most of our people think about the Greeks. So
Ryan Mencken would never do that.
Well, yeah, and this one's fun because I think that there's not many groups of people at all that have a negative view of the Greeks of ancient times. So this is, I think, particularly interesting. Mencken writes, "The Greeks of the palmy days remain the most overestimated people in all history. Ever since the Renaissance, it has been a high indecorum to question their genius, and never a month passes that another book does not come out praising them in loud, astounding terms. More men of the first rank were assembled in the Athens of Pericles, we are told, than any other city or even any other nation has ever housed. Going further, we are told that they remained unsurpassed to this day in quality as in quantity. Greek science is depicted as the father of all modern science, Greek art as the art, Greek philosophy as the last word in reason, and the Greek government of Pericles' time as democracy made perfect. And all this, alas, there is mainly only bunkum. The plain facts are that Greek science, even at its best, would be hard to distinguish from the science prevailing among Hottentots, Haitians, and Mississippi Baptists today. That Greek art was chiefly only derivative and extremely narrow in range. That Greek philosophy was quite as idiotic as any other philosophy, and that the government of the Greeks, even at its best, was worse than the worst of Tammany. One discovers plenty of proofs of all this in the present massive volume. It was written by scholars sharing the usual academic prejudice in favor of everything Greek, but nevertheless, they managed to tell the truth in it, at least between the lines. They show that the salient Greek philosophers of Pericles' time were almost identical with the Chautauqua orators of bucolic America, and that the more enlightened Greeks regarded them as public nuisances. They show that beauty to the Greeks was not something for every day, but a rare luxury and means of display. They show that the Greek government was knavish and incompetent, that it was constantly engaging in crooked enterprises abroad, and frequently became so corrupt and oppressive at home that the decent people of Athens had to rise up and reform it. And they show that for most of the genuinely intelligent Greeks, were foreigners, and that such natives as showed sense, e.g., Aristophanes, were commonly thrown out of the country. The Greek language was the first lost tongue recovered in modern times, and the men who recovered it naturally made as much as they could of the ideas that came with it. Ever since the Renaissance, it has been a mark of intellectual distinction to know Greek, though there is no record that knowing it has ever helped any man to think profitable thoughts. That distinction, to be sure, now begins to fade and wear thin, but there was a time just before the beginning of the current rapid increase of knowledge when it rose above all other forms of intellectual eminence, and it was during that period that the world was saddled with the exalted view of Greece and the Greeks that still survives. Insofar as it is not a mere sentimentality, it is grounded, I believe, upon the scantiness of our records of other peoples, contemporaneous with the Greeks or preceding them. If the history of Greek philosophy were known accurately, it would probably turn out to be no more than an imitation of some earlier philosophy, now forgotten, and may be abandoned by its inventors as nonsense. In architecture and the other arts, it is certainly absurd to say that the Greeks invented anything. They got the column from the Egyptians, who had perfected it 1,000 years before the Parthenon, and they slavishly followed the Egyptians in their neglect of the arch. Their excellent materials were accidental, and in working them they showed no originality. Was the Greek drama really indigenous? I shall believe it when it is proved that the Sanskrit drama was also indigenous, and not an imitation of some Persian or maybe even Assyrian prototype. Were the Greeks scientists? Then so are the modern chiropractors. What they had of exact knowledge and fact was mainly borrowed, and most of it was spoiled in the borrowing. And the Greek religion, the best that one may say of it, is that none of the intelligent foreigners who frequented Athens believed in it, and that many of them were jailed, exiled, and even put to death for making fun of it. As for the Greek genius for politics, it revealed its true measure in the fact that no Greek government ever lasted for more than a century, and that most of them ended in scandal and disaster. Here I make no fatuous attempt to read the Greeks out of court altogether. They were, for their time, an enterprising and progressive people, and they left us an immensely rich heritage, partly of sound ideas and partly of pleasant delusions and superstitions. But we probably owe a great deal more to the Egyptians, and quite as much to the lesser peoples who infested the eastern shores of the Mediterranean, notably the Phoenicians, the earlier Minoans, the Jews, and the forerunners of the later Arabs. The one genuinely solid contribution of the Greeks to human progress lay in their attempt to synthesize and organize whatever knowledge was afloat in the world of their day. This business they achieved with great skill, but out of their own heads they produce little that is valid and important to modern man, save perhaps in the dreams of pedagogues seeking to astonish schoolboys. The Greeks themselves, restored to earth, would laugh at the pretension to the contrary, as they laughed at the Greco-maniac Romans. If they had any virtue above all others, it was the virtue of skepticism. They were, in that department at least, the first of modern men. The barbaric surges and thunders of the Odyssey, and these twilight days of Christendom, are moving only to professors of Greek, which is to say, to men whose opinions on any other subject would be rejected even by their fellow professors, and the enjoyment of Greek tragedy, that unparalleled bore, is confined almost wholly to actresses who have grown too fat for Ibsen. But the ideas of Lucian and Aristophanes still live, and so do those of the 400.
Yeah, so I guess to contextualize this, I'm making the presumption that at the time of writing, there was a lot more LARP going on among certain sectors of American culture in holding the Greeks and attending plays of the Greek variety with some very high class and noble seeking of the highest achievements humans have ever endeavor toward in Greek culture and this sort of thing.
In further interests of context, I would point out that Aristophanes, the one Greek he points out as being sensible, was a comedian who wrote plays about farts. So, yes, I think I have to say this, delightful as the prose is, it may be that Mencken veers a little bit into self-indulgence with this one.
Well, and so it's not just the Americans. This is a very European focus focus first and foremost on the Greeks. And it was the fact that the Europeans were so advanced in teaching Greek history, language, philosophy, and whatnot else, and the Americans were seen as rootless moderns was a major sticking point up until very recently. And there are still many classicists in the modern day who will have these same pretensions. So this is a if you will, like a side attack upon some of the more European strands of conservatism and what have you. It's probably not a LARP. It would be a stretch to claim that, but it certainly was a thing that was hammered against the Americans, was that they didn't concern themselves so much with the Greeks, the classics, and what have you. So,
although in retro, there's a sort of I guess, revisionist history that projects that sort of. I mean, I guess if you look at how Washington D.C. is built, I guess it's trying to retrofit the American Republic to appear as if it is a Greco-Roman Republic.
Well, yeah, look at the architecture of the time. There's a literal school of architecture called Greek Revival, which was at its height a little before this essay was written, but it was very much in the zeitgeist when Mencken was writing.
On the right today, you have this thing, sort of equivalent, where people really, really, really like the Roman Empire, which, don't get me wrong, the Roman Empire is cool.
I think about it every day.
As our friend El Templar, or Cringewalker as he was formerly and currently still known, to be honest, points out, the Roman Empire was basically just the blob. It was a giant military bureaucracy that only served to aggregate all resources into its military to further expand and conquer everything. And what we call Europe was only able to emerge after this giant vacuum that sucked all resources into its imperial center was not really extinguished is the wrong word, but placed under new management, let's say.
But yeah, this is something. So many classicists. This is another sort of sticking point that they'll have. Will insist that, like, civilization, Western civilization, European civilization, or whatever else has its origin in the Greeks. Yet many of us would point to most of what we recognize coming from that Germanic invasion, and many of the Germanic kingdoms that resulted from it as being like the height of this Western or European civilization. So this is these types of people that Mencken is lambasting here are still around. They're nowhere near as popular. They're not dominant. They're mostly on the way out. Their field of study is much smaller than it ever has been in history, especially in the universities. But it's worth recognizing that this line of thought was would have been very annoying to deal with whenever it was at its height, because if you wanted to argue anything political, you probably want to argue the things that are actually currently happening, what their consequences are, what should be done, and whatnot else. And you probably don't want to argue about how this can all really be traced back to a paragraph from Aristotle, and that you actually don't just understand Aristotelian political theory in order to talk politics. Because that's like this is the kind of person that's being criticized here under this idea of the Greeks. He's assaulting the whole thing by saying the Greeks really aren't that noteworthy. Their philosophy sucks. The dramas that they have are everywhere. If you notice, he doesn't criticize the drama. He criticizes this idea that the Greek drama is like the ideal. So this is you can interpret this subversively, or you can very easily interpret this as like idol smashing. So it can go either way, really.
Indeed, it is remarkable the extent to which many strains of thought in Mencken's time and ours try to conflate classical civilization with Western civilization, although classical civilization is an antecedent to Western civilization, as Spengler took great pains to point out, it is a very, very different thing.
Yes, and it doesn't. The line of thought that I put forward, this idea that we just need to reduce everything back to like some Greek philosopher, is not. That's not explicitly mentioned in this article, but that's how they would. It's how they would talk about things like art, philosophy, science, and whatever else. That's why he is so strong in his attack that any of this can be traced back to the Greeks. He's trying to refute it.
Hmm.
I'm sure anyone currently listening is familiar with these types of people today that try to do the same thing. The endless line of reasoning to try to figure out what the original bad idea was politically or the original bad idea theologically. Um, I sympathize greatly with this article because I hate that use of time.
It's interesting, though, he attributes our obsession with the Greeks to the paucity of records from other contemporaneous peoples, which begs the question, why are there so many more records of the Greeks than any of the other cultures?
Well, he does credit them specifically for that, so
Yeah.
it's the one positive mark that they get. However, I do find that interesting because there is a tendency, especially amongst academics, thinkers, and what have you, the more that they study something, this is probably it's probably not just them. It's probably a general mankind sort of thing. But the more that they study something, take in information about something, look at something, the more that they find all things are connected to that.
Hmm.
So, I imagine that if you set up a Assyrian studies department in a university and gave them hundreds of years to translate Assyrian records, speculate about Assyrian politics and history and whatnot else, you would find a lot of claims that all philosophy can be reduced back to Assyria or something
The
similar.
Assyrian professor came down like a wolf on the fold, and his citations were gleaming in purple and gold.
Yes, right. All right.
All right, which of us other two shall read the next essay?
Why don't you take this one, Charlie, as it's a short one?
Very well. War, from the American Mercury, September 1929. War naturally sucks in those who can be most profitably spared and lets go most of those whose talents are really useful. One hears now and then of promising young men cut down too soon, but the science of statistics scarcely justifies the accompanying mourning. Let us turn, for example, to the Civil War. In the Union Army during the 4 years of the war, there were 2,666,999 666 He's doing this on purpose, isn't he? 2,666,999 men who reached the field, and of this number, 110,070 were killed in battle or died of wounds. 199,720 died of disease, and 40,154 perished otherwise, murdered, killed by accident, or done to death in prisons. Of those who were murdered or died of accident or disease, probably 100,000 would have died anyhow. Deducting that number, the total net loss comes to about 250,000. How many men were wounded is not certain, but the number probably ran to at least 1 million. We don't know, of course, what the dead men would have done if they had lived, but we may reach some approximation to it by examining the wounded who survived. How many of them after the war contributed anything that was genuinely interesting to civilization? Searching the record for weary days and nights, I can find but 3 names, those of Major Ambrose Bierce, Captain Oliver Wendell Holmes, Jr., and Private George Westinghouse. The typical eminentissimo who survived the Civil War, wow, that's a great word, eminentissimo, was not of this company. He was the shallow political plug, McKinley. All the really important men of the post-Civil War era, all the men who developed and fecundated such culture as we have now, from John D. Rockefeller to Walter Whitman, from Grover Cleveland to William James, from Mark Twain to Cyrus Field, from Andy Carnegie to Mark Hanna, from William Dean Howells to Bronson Howard, from John Fiske to James Russell Lowell, and from Willard Gibbs to Brigham Young. All these men were slackers and leaped not to the cannon's roar. The 3 exceptions that research reveals I have listed. Apply the ratio to those who perished, and it appears that the Civil War cost American culture exactly 3/4 of a really valuable man. Call Fitz James O'Brien, who died of his wounds, the other fourth, the net loss comes to one man. The melancholy conclusion that the science of statistics thus points to is amply confirmed by a study of military history. Of all the arts practiced by man, the art of the soldier seems to call for at least intelligence and to develop the least professional competency. Every battle recorded in history appears as a series of almost incredible blunders and imbecilities, always at least on one side and usually on both. One marvels reading the chronicles that any major engagement was ever won. Even the greatest generals, for example, Bonaparte, walk idiotically into palpable traps and waste thousands of lives getting themselves out. The lesser fry proceed heroically from disaster to disaster, as Burnside did during the Civil War and Joffre during the World War. The simplest problem of their ancient and elemental business flabbergasts them. They seem to be congenitally incapable of reasoning clearly, even when all the facts are before them. And at the enterprise of unearthing those facts, they show only the gross and pathetic ineptitude of a second-rate lawyer or a third-rate pedagogue. Whenever, at the practice of their art in the field, they confront a problem of any complexity, they have to get help from civilians, i.e., from men not paralyzed by training in their professional numbskullery. It was so, as everyone knows, in the War of 1914 to 18, the great captains on the two sides lay locked in a bloody and horrible embrace until engineers, chemists, and press agents came into their rescue and pried them loose, all while behind the lines they were laboriously drilling their recruits in the archaic marchings and counter-marchings of the old Dessauer. Yet the human race, after watching such bunglers perform their gory buffooneries, cheers them when they come home, dazed and empty-headed, and thrusts into its highest honors among them. What a certificate to its judgment, its common sense, its sense of humor, its right to survive on Earth.
Yeah, so this one cuts specifically against two pretty popular right-wing thoughts, memes, talking points, whatever you want to call them. Number one is that while it is tragic that millions of men perish in war, this is not to minimize that, to say that I want to be there or that it doesn't matter or what have you. It doesn't destroy a culture necessarily because those specific people died. Obviously, wars can harm civilization. They can kill valuable people and whatnot else, but Mencken here is trying to very grimly tell you, at least looking at the American Civil War, which saw pretty massive mobilization on both sides, all of the people of note after the war didn't really seem to come from the army. So it's something interesting there. It kind of cuts against this right-wing idea that when there was a major war in Western history that all of the talent died, all of the good people died, all of the most culturally foundational people died. Mencken is trying to provide a counter-narrative here, not necessarily so. The other major meme or talking point that this cuts against is the sort of right-wing fascination and reverence for veterans, which Mencken isn't even talking about any specific veteran. He is just speaking in the abstract after extrapolating from these statistics. He's really trying to point out they are very average, normal, unremarkable people. So it's this one is very interesting because it's he very briefly points out the errors in both of these lines of thought.
One does wonder what Mencken would make of "Thank you for your service." Of course, just to be fair, this isn't. He purports to be resorting to statistical science and then does nothing of the sort. He cherry picks a few examples of what he views to be a valuable man, but doesn't compare that to the rate of valuable men by his standards in the general population. He's merely picking some names and drawing a conclusion. So this is rhetoric. It is not actually any kind of empirical analysis of the question.
Yeah, that's certainly the case. However, he does... The fact that this is very... The connection to the average or the rest of the population, I think, is part of the point here. There's not... In Mencken's view, there's not many overmen, if you will.
No.
So that's the point that he's trying to get at here, is that they really aren't in the military, and they aren't in the military at this like really highly representative state. So
Indeed.
it is rhetoric. This is most certainly not statistical science, but it really cuts against those two memes that I was talking about just a moment ago.
Indeed. The puncturing of a Marshall balloon.
One is reminded of Yoda's line in The Empire Strikes Back, "War not make one great."
Truer words.
Okay, so next we're moving on to Statesman. Mr. Auberon Quinn, would you like to take this one?
Pater Patriae, which is, of course, father of his country, from Damn, a Book of Calumny, 1918. If George Washington were alive today, what a shining mark he would be for the whole camorra of uplifters, forward-lookers, and professional patriots. He was the Rockefeller of his time, the richest man in the United States, a promoter of stock companies, a land grabber, an exploiter of mines and timber. He was a bitter opponent of foreign entanglements and denounced their evils in harsh, specific terms. He had a liking for forthright and pugnacious men and a contempt for lawyers, schoolmasters, and all other such obscurantists. He was not pious. He drank whiskey whenever he felt chilly and kept a jug of it handy. He knew far more profanity than Scripture and used and enjoyed it more. He had no belief in the infallible wisdom of the common people, but regarded them as inflammatory dolts and tried to save the Republic from them. He advocated no sure cure for all the sorrows of the world and doubted that such a panacea existed. He took no interest in the private morals of his neighbors. Inhabiting these states today, George would be ineligible for any office of honor or profit. The Senate would never dare confirm him. The president would not think of nominating him. He would be on trial in the newspapers for belonging to the money power. The Sherman Act would have him in its toils. He would be under indictment by every grand jury south of the Potomac. The Methodists of his native state would be denouncing him. He had a still at Mount Vernon. As a debaucher of youth, a recruiting officer for insane asylums, a poisoner of the home. And what a chance there would be for that ambitious young district attorney who thought to shadow him on his peregrinations and grab him under the Mann Act. So,
yes.
Mencken's
we're
just
cutting at this. We're cutting at this idea that the progressives are like a natural progression, if you will, from American history and thought. Mencken says most certainly not.
No, definitely.
You were peaking your mic quite a bit there, so I'm not sure if you were just hamming it up more than normal, but might want to watch that.
I shall restrain myself to my customary levels of ham.
Yeah, it sounds good like that. I'm just came out a little twist.
This one I found particularly interesting. Printed in 1918, and Mencken is already using this rhetorical trick that many of us will use today. That if we applied any of the standards of like the modern political orthodoxy to any past American, they would not be seen as they would be seen as radicals or evil or what have you. He's doing this with George Washington, comparing them to the reigning sort of religious progressivism that existed in his day. I think it's worth reiterating this. I think a lot of people, as they were getting into politics nowadays, came across anti-progressive polemics and have discarded them recently because they see that the progressives were particularly anti-immigration, demographic change, and what have you, these good things that they were mostly good on. This is pretty indicative of the progressive tendencies that didn't quite make it to the modern revision, though. This prohibitionism, this strong antitrust and strange view of like a conspiracy of corporations and the government. Of course, now we have probably more accurate conspiracies of who controls the government. There's not as many antitrust enthusiasts on the
we could
American
do with
right
a few
today.
more antitrust enthusiasts these days, but yes.
And something else that is very much out of vogue on the modern right as the antipathy towards these second Great Awakening denominations that are the vast majority of Americans. Those are that's a group you have to defend if you want to defend the vast majority of Americans or people in general. But of course, if you have a philosophy like Mencken does, the average person is not all that remarkable and in many ways is bad.
Yeah,
So
and Mencken makes the point so much more succinctly than we managed to when we talked about the Articles of Confederation and the Constitution. Washington now is ever lauded as this champion of democracy and progressivism, but as Mencken is pointing out here, most of the attributes of the man were very much quite the opposite.
yes, yeah. So this is a very brief sort of counterpoint against a lot of these more popular online right-wing histories that are emerging. Even even the most ardent defender of progressivism in the modern day really doesn't try to defend prohibition as a moral statement like the progressives would. That issue has mostly been surrendered. Same thing with a lot of the antitrust. No one cares. It's apathy at this point. There's like an idea that corporations are bad, but it's not because they're corporations with corporate power that people think that they're bad. Usually, they might have that inclination in the back of their mind, but that's never what comes to the fore when anyone tweets, writes, or what have you.
Indeed.
So, we'll move on then to another brief analysis on the next page. Abraham Lincoln, originally printed in May 1920. And H.L. Mencken writes, "Some time ago, a publisher told me that there are 4 kinds of books that seldom, if ever, lose money in the United States. First, murder stories. Secondly, novels in which the heroine is forcibly overcome by the hero. Thirdly, volumes on spiritualism, occultism, and other such claptrap. And fourthly, books on Lincoln. But despite all the vast mass of Lincolnania, and the constant discussion of old Abe in other ways, even so elemental a problem as that of his religious ideas, surely an important matter in any competent biography, is yet but half solved. Was he a Christian? Did he believe in the divinity of Jesus? I am left in doubt. He was very polite about it and very cautious, as befitted a politician in need of Christian votes, but how much genuine conviction was in that politeness? And if his occasional references to Jesus were thus open to question, what if his rather vague avowals of belief in a personal God and in the immortality of the soul? Herndon and some of his other early friends always maintained that he was an atheist, but the Reverend William E. Barton, one of the best and later Lincolnologists, argues that this atheism was simply disbelief in the idiotic Methodist and Baptist dogmas of his time. That 9 Christian churches out of 10, if he were alive today, would admit him to their high privileges and prerogatives without anything worse than a few warning coughs. As for me, I still wonder. Lincoln becomes the American solar myth, the chief butt of American credulity and sentimentality. Washington, of late years, has been perceptibly humanized. Every schoolboy now knows that he used to swear a good deal, and was a sharp trader, and had a quick eye for a pretty ankle. But meanwhile, the varnishers and veneers have been busily converting Abe into a plaster saint, thus making him fit for adoration in the YMCA's. All the popular pictures of him show him in his robes of state, and wearing an expression fit for a man about to be hanged. There is, so far as I know, not a single portrait of him showing him smiling, and yet he must have cackled a good deal, first and last. Who ever heard of a storyteller who didn't? Worse, there is an obvious effort to pump all his human weaknesses out of him, and so leave him a mere moral apparition, a sort of amalgam of John Wesley and the Holy Ghost. What could be more absurd? Lincoln, in point of fact, was a practical politician, of a long experience and high talents, and by no means cursed with ideal superstitions. Until he emerged from Illinois, they always put the women, children, and clergy to bed when he got a few gourds of corn aboard, and it is a matter of unescapable record that his career in the state legislature was indistinguishable from that of a Tammany Nietzsche. Even his handlings of the slavery question was that of a politician, not that of a messiah. Nothing alarmed him more than the suspicion that he was an abolitionist, and Barton tells of an occasion when he actually fled town to avoid meeting the issue squarely. An abolitionist would have published the Emancipation Proclamation the day after the first Battle of Bull Run. But Lincoln waited until the time was more favorable, until Lee had been hurled out of Pennsylvania, and more important still, until the political currents were safely running his way. Even so, he freed the slaves in only a part of the country. All the rest continued to clank their chains until he himself was an angel in heaven. Like William Jennings Bryan, he was a dark horse made suddenly formidable by fortunate rhetoric. The Douglas debate launched him, and the Cooper Union speech got him the presidency. His talent for emotional utterance was an accomplishment of late growth. His early speeches were mere empty fireworks, the hollow rhodomontades of the era. But in middle life he purged his style of ornament, and it became almost badly simple. And it is for that simplicity that he is remembered today. The Gettysburg speech is at once the shortest and most famous oration in American history. Put beside it, all the whoopings of the Websters, Sumners, and Everetts seem gaudy and silly. It is eloquence brought to a pellucid and almost gem-like perfection, the highest emotion reduced to a few poetical phrases. Nothing else precisely like it is to be found in the whole range of oratory. Lincoln himself never even remotely approached it. It is genuinely stupendous. One moment. Sorry. But let us not forget that it is poetry, not logic, beauty, not sense. Think of the argument in it. Put it into the cold words of every day. The doctrine is simply this, that the Union soldiers who died at Gettysburg sacrificed their lives to the cause of self-determination, that government of the people, by the people, for the people, should not perish from the earth. It is difficult to imagine anything more untrue. The Union soldiers in that battle actually fought against self-determination. It was the Confederates who fought for the right of their people to govern themselves. What was the practical effect of the Battle of Gettysburg? What else than the destruction of the old sovereignty of the states, i.e., of the people of the states? The Confederates went into battle free. They came out with their freedom subject to the supervision and veto of the rest of the country. And for nearly 20 years, that veto was so effective that they enjoyed scarcely more liberty in the political sense than so many convicts in the penitentiary. So, this isn't really a unique far-right idea, this revision of Lincoln. Here you have Mencken writing basically the same talking points that you can find in the alleged far-right today in 1920. It's really not, this isn't even that much of an exaggeration, everything that he's saying here. This is perhaps one of the most to the point essays that he has that doesn't go beyond its reasoning. So this one I find interesting. There's a tendency on the right to sort of revise anything that came from its more radical or libertarian or what have you priors from the last decade. I'm sure that there's probably already some online right-winger out there trying to talk about how Lincoln was actually good. This is a tradition, this bashing of Lincoln, that goes back quite a ways, though. Mencken, as we already have discussed, not known for his just enduring, unquestioning love of the South.
Indeed. Yeah, there's not really much to add to what Mencken says. Lincoln was, of course, lying in the Gettysburg Address, and people these days will sometimes advance geopolitical arguments. But Europe, if we weren't united, but yes, when you look at the words and you look at the deeds, the contradiction is simply there.
Yeah. Looking at the next essay we have up as well, one kind of from what he's written on Roosevelt, I wonder if Mencken had an inkling, or significantly more than an inkling, that Roosevelt would be a figure who would be historiographied much as Lincoln was. I kind of get the feeling that Mencken saw that coming at the time, even before Roosevelt and people of his ilk like Churchill became these additional like saint-like figures in American and English history.
Indeed, it's
Well,
very interesting.
For
Sorry, go ahead,
Mencken
Ryan.
specifically, sorry. For Mencken specifically, though, it's not just it's not Roosevelt 2 either. It's also Roosevelt 1. For all the bad qualities Lincoln finds in most politicians, he sees all of them basically in both Roosevelts. I don't have much of the essays that he wrote about FDR towards the end of his life, Mencken's life, that is. I guess both in actuality, but
We got a flavor of it last week.
we did get a little bit. But Lincoln found this sort of unquestioning draw to bravado and sudden and forceful strength to be sort of like a thought-terminating quality that most people fell for. It's very clear if you read him on any of his other articles that he's collected in this book. He really does not like it when the average dupe falls for very masculine propaganda about the great leader. So
yeah, that is certainly.
So it's Washington, Lincoln, and also Teddy Roosevelt, FDR, and most of these other people who were absolutely glorified by the mainstream right until very recently, and even then, some still persist in their deification. Sorry.
Yeah, the through line pretty much through all of Mencken's work is that he will suffer no idols.
Yeah, well, this is a major problem that persists even to today in regards to this Roosevelt he's writing about now that we're about to read about, rather. And I mean, you also see the same kind of idolatry among these sort of figures that are set as these masculine avatars. I mean, Donald Trump is literally one of them, right? He's now a figure that has really ascended to the domain of an idol for a lot of people today, much like Roosevelt at the time, and continues to be that exact sort of idol, completely just using this singular like masculine image and style in place of actually looking at any of the things he did or really believed or accomplished, etc.
Indeed.
So, in some sense, we've gotten absolutely nowhere in terms of the problems Mencken is trying to address.
Human nature is fixed.
Yeah, it's almost.
Unfortunately,
like
the average person is still average even today.
Surely not most of them.
Oh,
all right, Roosevelt. You want me to take this one?
Sure.
So, by way of preparation, I want to ask you, Ryan. This article on Roosevelt is entitled "Roosevelt Won," which, to our modern ears, makes perfect sense because we know in 2026 that there was a Roosevelt too. But this apparently was written in 1920. Do you think that Roosevelt 1 was a later edition when this was collected, or do you think that was how it ran?
Roosevelt 1 is not the name of the original article that he wrote. This is his title in the Chrestomathy.
Okay, so this is looking back when he pens that type.
In fact, in this as well, he references that he wrote. We'll get there. He references that he wrote something about Roosevelt, Teddy Roosevelt, whenever he died, an obituary that didn't go over well. And I actually did track that down and find it, so I have that now. It's just a historical record, and it's very contemporaneous as well. There's very little to no reference to any other Roosevelts, so it wasn't on his mind.
Okay. Well, this being printed in the Smart Set, March 1920. Roosevelt's reaction to World War I must occupy a large part of any adequate account of him, for that reaction was probably more comprehensively typical of the man than any other business of his life. It displayed not only his whole stock of political principles, but also his whole stock of political tricks. It plumbed, on one hand, the depths of his sagacity, and on the other, the depths of his insincerity. Fundamentally, I am convinced he was quite out of sympathy with, and even quite unable to comprehend, the body of doctrine upon which the Allies, and later the United States, based their case. To him, it must have seemed insane when it was not hypocritical, and hypocritical when it was not insane. His instincts were profoundly against the loosing of democratic fustian upon the world. He believed in strongly centralized states, founded upon power and devoted to enterprises far transcending mere internal government. He was an imperialist of the type of Cecil Rhodes, Treitschke, and de Classe. But the fortunes of domestic politics jockeyed him into the position of standing as the spokesman of an almost exactly contrary philosophy. The visible enemy before him was Wilson. What he wanted as a politician was something that he could get only by wresting it from Wilson, and Wilson was too cunning to yield it without making a tremendous fight, chiefly by chicane, whooping for peace while preparing for war, playing the mob fear against mob fear, concealing all his genuine motives and desires beneath clouds of Chautauqua rhetoric, leading a mad dance whose tune changed at every swing. He was an opponent that more than once puzzled Roosevelt, and in the end flatly dismayed him. Here was a mob master with a technique infinitely more subtle and effective than his own. So lured into an unequal combat, the Rough Rider got bogged into absurdity so immense that only the democratic anesthesia to absurdity saved him. To make any progress at all, he was forced into fighting against his own side. He passed from the scene bawling piteously for a cause that, at bottom, it is impossible to imagine him believing in, and in terms of a philosophy that was foreign to his true faith, as it was the faith of Wilson. In the whole affair, there was a colossal irony. Both contestants were intrinsically frauds. When soon after his death, I ventured, in a magazine article, to call attention to Roosevelt's philosophical kinship to the Kaiser, I received letters of denunciation from all parts of the United States, and not a few forthright demands that I recant on penalty of lynch law. Prudence demanded that I heed these demands. We live in a curious and often unsafe country. Hailed before a Roosevelt judge for speeding my automobile or spitting on a sidewalk or carrying a jug, I might have been railroaded for 10 years under some constructive corollary of the Espionage Act. But there were two things that supported me in my contumacy to the departed. One was a profound reverence for and fidelity to the truth, sometimes almost amounting to fanaticism. The other was the support of eminent Iowa right thinker and patriot, Professor S.P. Sherman. Writing in The Nation, Professor Sherman put the thing in plain terms. With the essentials in the religion of the militarists of Germany, he said, Roosevelt was utterly in sympathy. Utterly? Perhaps the adverb is a bit too strong. There was in the man a certain instinctive antipathy to the concrete aristocrat, and in particular to the aristocrat's private code. The produce, no doubt, of his essentially bourgeois origin and training. But if he could not go with the Junkers all the way, he could at least go the whole length of their distrust of the third order, the undifferentiated masses below. Here, I dare say, he owed a lot to Nietzsche. He was always reading German books, and among them, no doubt, was also Sprach Zarathustra and Jesuits von Gut und Böse. In fact, the echoes were constantly sounding in his own harangues. Years ago, as an intellectual exercise while confined to hospital, I devised and printed a giveaway of the Rooseveltian philosophy in parallel columns. In one column, abstracts from the strenuous life. In the other, abstracts from Nietzsche. The borrowings were numerous and unescapable. Theodore had swallowed Friedrich as a farm wife swallows Peruna. Bottle, cork, label, and testimonials. Worse, the draft whetted his appetite, and soon he was swallowing the Kaiser of the Gardecavaliere mess, and the battleship launching speeches, another somewhat defective Junker. In his palmy days, it is often impossible to distinguish his political theological bulls from those of Wilhelm. During the war, indeed, I suspect that some of them were boldly lifted by British Press Bureau and palmed off as the felonious imprudences of Potsdam. Wilhelm was his model in Weltpolitik and in sociology, exegetics, administration, law, sport, and connubial polity, no less. Both roared for doughty armies, eternally prepared, for the theory that the way to prevent war is to make all conceivable enemies think twice, thrice, 10 times. Both dreamed of gigantic navies with battleships as long as the Brooklyn Bridge. Both preached incessantly the duty of the citizen to the state, but soft pedal upon the duty of the state to the citizen. Both praised the habitually gravid wife. Both delighted in the armed pursuit of the Iowa fauna. Both heavily patronized the fine arts. Both were intimates of God and announced his desires with authority. Both believed that all men who stood opposed to them were prompted by the devil and would suffer for it in hell. In fact, if there were any difference between them, it was all in favor of Wilhelm. For one thing, he made very much fewer speeches. It took some colossal event, the launching of a dreadnought, or the birthday of a colonel general, to get him upon his legs. The Reichstag was not constantly deluged with his advice and upbraiding. For another thing, he was a milder and more modest man, one more accustomed, let us say, to circumstance and authority, and hence less intoxicated by the greatness of his high estate. Finally, he had been trained to think not only of his own immediate fortunes, but also of the remote interests of a family that, in his heyday, promised to hold the throne for many years. And so he cultivated a certain prudence, even a certain ingratiating suavity. He could, on occasion, be extremely polite to an opponent. But Roosevelt was never polite to an opponent. Perhaps a gentleman by what passes American standards, but he was surely never a gentle man. In a political career of nearly 40 years, he was never even fair to an opponent. All his gabble about the square deal was but merely so much protective coloration. No man facing him in the heat of controversy ever actually got a square deal. He took extravagant advantages. He played to the worst idiocies of the mob. He hit below the belt almost habitually. One never thinks of him as a duelist, say, of the school of Disraeli, Palmerston, and, to drop a hint, Blaine. One always thinks of him as a glorified bouncer, engaged in eternally clearing out bar rooms, and not too proud to gouge when the inspiration came to him, or to bite in the clinches, or to oppose the relatively fragile brass knuckles of the code with chair legs, bung starters, cuspidors, demijohns, and ice picks. Lawrence Abbott and William Roscoe Thayer, in their official lives, made elaborate efforts to depict their hero as one born with a deep loathing of the whole Prussian scheme of things. Abbott even went so far as to hint the attentions of the Kaiser during Roosevelt's historic tour of Europe on his return from Africa were subtly revolting to him. Nothing could be further more absurd. Sherman, in the article I have mentioned, blows up that nonsense by quoting from a speech made by the tourist in Berlin, a speech arguing for the most extreme sort of militarism in a manner that must have made even some of the Junkers blow their noses dubiously. This disproof need not be piled up. The America that Roosevelt dreamed of was always a sort of swollen Prussia, truculent without and regimented within. There were always a clank of the saber in his discourse, and he could not discuss the tamest matter without swaggering in his best dragoon fashion. Abbott gets into yet deeper waters when he sets up the doctrine that the invasion of Belgium threw his darling into an instantaneous and tremendous fit of moral indignation, and that the curious delay in the public exhibition thereof, so much discussed afterwards, was due to his, Abbott's, fatuous interference. A faux pas later regretted with much bitterness. Unluckily, the evidence he offers leaves me full of doubts. What the doctrine demands that one believe is simply this, that the man who, for mere commercial advantage, and in Frederick's famous phrase, to make himself talked of in the world, tore up the Treaty of 1848 between the United States and Colombia, whereby the United States forever guaranteed the sovereignty and ownership of the Colombians in the Isthmus of Panama. this same man, 13 years later, was horrified into a fever that Germany, facing powerful foes on two fronts, tore up the Treaty of 1832, guaranteeing not the sovereignty, but the bald neutrality of Belgium, a neutrality already destroyed, according to the evidence before the Germans, by Belgium's own acts. It is hard, without an inordinate strain upon the credulity, to believe any such thing, particularly in view of the fact that this instantaneous indignation was of the most impulsive and vocal men, was diligently concealed for at least 6 weeks, with the reporters camped down upon his doorstep by day and night, begging him to say the very thing that he left so darkly unsaid. Can one imagine Roosevelt, the red fire raging within him and skyrockets bursting in his veins, holding his peace for a month and a half? I have no doubt whatsoever that Abbott, whatever he says, desired to avoid embarrassing Wilson. But think of Roosevelt showing such delicacy. For one, I am not equal to the feat. All that unprecedented reticence, in fact, is far more readily explicable on other and less lofty grounds. What really happened, I presume to guess, my guess is that Roosevelt, like the great majority of other Americans, was not instantly and automatically outraged by the invasion of Belgium. On the contrary, he probably viewed it as regrettable, but not unexpected or unparalleled device of war. If anything, as something rather thrillingly gaudy and effective, a fine piece of virtuosity, pleasing to a military connoisseur.
Here we can stop a moment for just a little bit of analysis. So,
absolutely,
in American history, Roosevelt is typically considered the first progressive president, getting the presidency after the assassination of William McKinley. His brand of progressivism was much more corporatist than Wilson's. In fact, if you read Roosevelt's speeches on his new nationalism compared to Wilson's new freedom, just completely disregarding hindsight for a moment, it's easy to see that in the 1912 election, your two options for anyone that was actually going to win was basically Roosevelt completely advocating this very Prussian model of governing the United States, very forcibly as well, under this guise of fairness and equity, progress, and what have you, or a slightly more interventionist liberal, sort of like an English model in Wilson. So that's the campaign promises going into 1912. Wilson himself sort of taking Roosevelt's main political issue out from under him and committing his administration to like pure impartial antitrust regulation. Roosevelt famously tried to divide between good and bad trusts and only split up the bad trusts while outlining the good trusts. So that's like the historical background. All of the comparisons to Prussia, the Kaiser, and what have you, I think is very prescient for the online right, because like I said, the sort of rehabilitationist wing of the right towards Wilson and the wider progressive movement is that it was needed to make sure that the German contingent of America actually assimilated, became American, didn't have any sympathies towards Germany. That narrative has a major problem, of course, because the first and perhaps most popular progressive president had major sympathies towards Germany and did way more to model the United States after it than any German American did, really. So it's something to look at. These major sympathies towards Germany and Prussia were noted at the time. As you're seeing here with Mencken, many American libertarians noted it. This is why they're very critical of Prussia, is because they feel like it was imported by the progressives. And many of them would still say we live with this system today, this imported Prussian system. So it's worth pointing out this is like a counter narrative from a much older source at the time.
No, indeed. The Prussian influence on the American state beginning in this era is enormous. One looks, for instance, at the school system, the entire idea of grouping students by age and making them sit in a room for 6 hours a day. That's the Bismarckian education system that was imported whole cloth here, as against the more traditional American system of the schoolhouse, where all the children from the town of all ages were in one room learning together.
Yeah, and if you propose an economic system where you said it's just inevitable that economic or industries rather are going to centralize amongst basically aristocrats, so the state needs to pick and choose which aristocrats are going to be most productive for the state's ends of war, security, and what have you. It looks very much like the Prussian economy with its favored families managing the iron and steel works, artillery manufacturing, naval production, and what have you, while heavily penalizing other families and other industries due to political convenience. So it's a very Prussian system that the progressives favored.
Indeed. And then we'll talk more about this as we get further into it. But of course, these German sympathies that Roosevelt, at least in Mencken's suspicion, harbored in his heart of hearts, of course, put Roosevelt in an impossible political situation vis-a-vis Wilson. Moving on. But then came the deluge of Belgian atrocity stories and the organized campaign to enlist American sympathies. It succeeded very quickly. By the middle of August, the British Press Bureau was in full swing. By the beginning of September, the country was flooded with inflammatory stuff. 6 weeks after the war opened, it was already hazardous for a German in America to state his country's case. Meanwhile, the Wilson administration declared for neutrality and was still making a more or less sincere effort to practice it, at least on the surface. Here was Roosevelt's opportunity, and he leapt to it with sure instinct. On the one side was the administration that he detested, and that all his self-interest, e.g., his yearning to get back to his old leadership and become president again in 1917, prompted him to deal a mortal blow. And on the other side was a ready-made issue, full of emotional possibilities, stupendously pumped up by extremely clever propaganda, and so far unembraced by any other rabble-rouser of the first magnitude. Is it any wonder that he gave a whoop, jumped on his cayuse, and began screaming for war? In war lay the confusion of Wilson and the melodramatic renaissance of the Rough Rider, the professional hero, the national Barbarossa. In all of this, of course, I strip the process of its plumes and spangles and explain it and expose a chain of causes and effects that Roosevelt himself, if he were alive, would denounce as grossly contumelious to his native purity of spirit, and perhaps in all honesty. It is not necessary to raise any doubts as to that honesty. No one who has given any study to the development and propagation of political doctrine in the United States can have failed to notice how belief in issues among politicians tends to run in exact ratio to the popularity of those issues. Let the populace begin suddenly to swallow a new panacea or take fright at a new bugaboo, and instantly 9/10 of the masterminds of politics begin to believe that the panacea is a sure cure for all the malaises of the republic, and the bugaboo is an immediate and unbearable menace to all law, order, and domestic tranquility. At the bottom of this singular intellectual resilience, of course, there is a good deal of hard calculation. A man must keep up with the procession of crazes, or his day is swiftly done. But in it, there is also a considerations a good deal more subtle and maybe less discreditable. For one thing, a man devoted professionally to patriotism and wisdom of the fathers is very apt to come to a resigned sort of acquiescence in all the doctrinaire rubbish that lies beneath the national scheme of things. To believe, let us say, if not that the plain people are gifted with an infallible sagacity, then at least that they have an inalienable right to see their follies executed. Poll-parroting nonsense as a matter of daily routine, the politician ends by assuming that it is sense, even though he doesn't believe it. For another thing, there is the contagion of mob enthusiasm, a much underestimated moraine. No man is so remote and arctic that he is wholly safe from that contamination. It explains many extravagant phenomena of a democratic society. In particular, it explains why the mob leaders are so often a victim to his mob. Roosevelt is a perfectly typical politician devoted to the trade, not primarily because he is gnawed by ideals, but because he frankly enjoyed its rough and tumble encounters and its gaudy rewards. It was probably moved in both ways. Also, by the hard calculation that I have mentioned, if, by any ineptness of the British press agents and tear squeezers, indignation over the invasion of Belgium had failed to materialize, if, worse still, some gross infringement of American rights by the English had caused it to be forgotten completely, if, finally, Wilson had been whooping for war and the populace firmly against him, in such event, it goes without saying that the moral horror of Roosevelt would have stopped short at a very low amperage, and that he would have refrained from making it the center of his polity. But with things as they were, lying neatly to his hand, he permitted it to take on an extraordinary virulence, and before long all his old delight in German militarism had been converted into a lofty detestation of German militarism, and its chief spokesman on this side of the Atlantic became its chief opponent. Getting rid of that old delight, of course, was not easily achieved. The concrete enthusiasm could be throttled, but the habit of mind remained. Thus, one beheld the curious spectacle of militarism belabored in terms of militarism, of the Kaiser arraigned in unmistakably Kaiserliche tones. Such violent swallowings and regurgitations were no novelties to the man. His whole political career was marked, in fact, by performances of the same sort. The issues that won him the most votes were issues that, at bottom, he didn't believe in. There was always a mental reservation in his rhetoric. He got into politics not as a tribune of the plain people, but as an amateur reformer of the snobbish type common in the 80s. By the nation out of the social register. He was a young Harvard man, scandalized by the discovery that his town was run by men with such names as Michael O'Shaughnessy and Terence Guggen, that his social inferiors were his political superiors. His sympathies were essentially anti-democratic. He believed in strong centralization, the concentration of power in a few hands, the strict regimentation of the nether herd, the abandonment of platitudes. His heroes were such Federalists as Morris and Hamilton. He made his first splash in the world by writing about them and praising them. Worse, his daily associations were with the old Union League crowd of high tariff Republicans, the men most apoplectically opposed to every movement from below, safe and sane men, highly conservative and suspicious men, the profiteers of peace, as they afterward became, the profiteers of war. His early adventures in politics were not very fortunate, nor did they reveal any capacity for leadership. The bosses of the day took him in rather sportively, played him for what they could get out of him, and then turned him loose. In a few years, he became disgusted and went west. Returning after a bit, he encountered catastrophe. As a candidate for mayor of New York, he was drubbed unmercifully. He went back to the West. He was up to this time a comic figure, an anti-politician victimized by politicians, a pseudo-aristocrat made ridiculous by the mob masters he detested. But meanwhile, something was happening that changed the whole color of the political scene and was destined eventually to give Roosevelt his chance. That something was a shifting in what might be called the foundations of reform. Up to now, it had been an essentially aristocratic movement, superior, sniffish, and anti-democratic. But hereafter, it took on a strongly more democratic color and began to adopt democratic methods. More of the change gave it a new life. What Harvard, the Union League Club, and Godkin's Nation failed to accomplish, the plain people now undertook to accomplish. Excuse me. This invasion of the old citadel of virtue was first observed in the West, and its manifestations out there must have given Roosevelt a good deal more disquiet than satisfaction. It is impossible to imagine him finding anything into his taste in the outlandish doings of the populists, in the wild schemes of the pre-Bryan dervishes. His instincts were against all that sort of thing, but as the movement spread toward the East, it took on a certain urbanity, and by the time it reached the seaboard, it had begun to be almost civilized. With this new brand of reform, Roosevelt now made terms. It was full of principles that outraged all his pruderies, but at least it promised to work. His entire political history thereafter, down to the day of his death, was a history of compromises with the new forces, of a gradual yielding for strategic purposes to ideas that were intrinsically at odds with his congenital prejudices. When, after a generation of that sort of compromising, the so called Progressive Party was organized and he seized the leadership of it from the Westerners who had founded it, he performed a feat of wholesale inglutination that must forever hold a high place upon the roll of political prodigies. That is to say, he swallowed at one gigantic gulp and out of the same Herculean jug the most amazing mixture of social, political, and economic sure cures that ever got down by one hero, however valiant, however athirst, a cocktail made up of all the elixirs hawked among the boobery in his time, from woman suffrage to direct primary, and from initiative and referendum to the short ballot, and from prohibition to public ownership, and from trust busting to the recall of judges. This
So
Homeric.
here, just a break here in a moment because we sort of switched from his German sympathies here. This is also hilarious because I forget which Republican president he spoke at the convention for, but Roosevelt specifically spoke in favor of the pro-tariff Republican ticket sometime after Reconstruction. I don't think it was Benjamin Harrison. It might have been Rutherford B. Hayes, but I could be mistaken. I can't quite remember. But in it, he sounds just like a very plain establishment figure. And if you read the speech, he's very clear. His main goals are like the dominance of the GOP. He's very much a party man. And it's not entirely clear that that ever left, except during this transition that Mencken is describing here. Now, I find this section of this very long diatribe against Roosevelt to be the most interesting because it's kind of describing someone that began by believing in something. He was as close as to an aristocrat as you could get in that part of the country. He was trying to defend that aristocratic class and what have you, doing the very conservative thing of offering reform to the lower classes on the terms of the aristocracy. This is a very Disraelian or very Bismarckian program.
Mm-hmm.
And then, whenever the political opportunity hits, he decides to abandon all that for power grabbing, which many of our people prescribe to people. You need to quiet down or even discard or compromise your beliefs in order to grab power in the modern day. Roosevelt did this. And as Mencken is describing here, it's a complete absurdity in the amount of contradictions that he ended up having to spout in order to grab that power. And then also, as he's describing, the reforms that he allegedly carried out in the end that he originally had sympathies for back when the main reforms were anti-corruption reforms after the Grant administration. The actual reforms that he ended up providing the country tended to protect the people that he was originally trying to crusade against at the very beginning.
Mm-hmm.
This is this theory of the progressive era, this idea that the progressives were specifically defending the social classes that they rhetorically were speaking against, is a historiography put together by Gabriel Kolko in a book called The Triumph of Conservatism. He postdates Mencken here, so what Mencken is describing would later come to fruition in that book, but it's worth pointing out. This is the danger. I would say it's what necessarily happens if we go back to those perfidious Greeks that he was talking about earlier in their parables. Almost every story that we get of someone who decides to sacrifice their beliefs, the ideals, and what have you in order to obtain power ends up getting corrupted almost immediately, if not as soon as they decide to give up the belief. So I find this section of the diatribe to be very instructive in that regard.
Indeed. And it is not without cautionary application to the present day.
Yeah, right. So that's everything that we do here. You should be extrapolating to the present day, the current situation. We could be more explicit on stream. Sometimes we do get explicit, but this is basically everything that we talk about happens in the modern day, unfortunately.
Let the listener understand. All right. This Homeric achievement made him the head of the most tatterdemalion party ever seen in American politics. A party composed of such incompatible ingredients and hung together so loosely that it began to disintegrate the moment it was born. In part, it was made up of mere disordered enthusiasts, the believers in anything and everything, pathetic victims of the credulity complex. That's a beautiful phrase, the credulity complex. That we have to start using that. Oh my. Habitual followers of the jitney messiahs, incurable hopers, and snufflers. But in part, it was also made up of rich converts like Roosevelt himself, men eager for office and disappointed by the old parties, and now quite willing to accept any aid that half idiot doctrinaires could give them. I have no doubt that Roosevelt himself, carried away by the emotional hurricanes of the moment, and especially by the quasi religious monkey shines that marked the first progressive convention, gradually convinced himself that at least some of the doctrinaires, in the midst of all their imbecility, yet preached a few ideas that were workable and even perhaps sound. But at bottom, he was against them, and not only in the matter of their specific remedies, but also in the larger matter of their childish faith in the wisdom and virtue of the plain people. Roosevelt, for all his fluent mastery of democratic counterwords and democratic gestures and all the rest of the armamentarium of the mob master, had no such faith in his heart of hearts. He didn't believe in democracy. He believed simply in government. His remedy for all the great pangs and longings of existence was not a dispersion of authority, but a hard concentration of authority. He was not in favor of unlimited government, of unlimited experiment. He was in favor of a rigid control from above, a despotism of inspired prophets and policemen. He was not for democracy as his followers understood democracy, and as it actually is and must be. He was for a paternalism of a true Bismarckian pattern, almost of a Napoleonic pattern. Paternalism concerning itself with all things from regulation of coal mining and meatpacking to the regulation of spelling and marital rights. His instincts were those of the property owning Tory, not those of the romantic liberal. Even when, for campaign purposes, he came to terms with the liberals in his thoughts, always ranged far afield. When he tackled the trusts, the thing that he had in his mind's eye was not a restoration of competition, but the subordination of all private trusts to one great national trust, with himself at its head. And when he attacked the courts, it was not because they put their own prejudices before the law, but because they refused to put his prejudices before the law. In all his career, no one ever heard him make an argument for the rights of the citizen. His eloquence was always expended in expounding the duties of the citizen. I have before me a speech in which he pled for a spirit of kindly justice toward every man and woman, but that seems to be as far as he ever got in that direction, and it was the gratuitous justice of the absolute monarch that he apparently had in mind, not the autonomous and inalienable justice of a free society. The duties of the citizen, as he understood them, related not only to acts, but also to thoughts. There was, to his mind, a simple body of primary doctrine, and dissent from it was the foulest of crimes. No man could have been more bitter against his opponents, or more unfair to them, or more ungenerous. In this department, indeed, even so gifted a specialist in dishonorable controversy as Wilson seldom surpassed him. He never stood up to a frank and chivalrous debate. He dragged herrings across the trail. He made seductive faces at the gallery. He capitalized on his enormous talents as an entertainer, his rank as a national hero, his public influence and consequence. The two great lawsuits in which he was engaged were screaming burlesque upon justice. He tried them in the newspapers before ever they were called. He befogged them with irrelevant issues. His appearances in court were not the appearances of a witness standing on a level with other witnesses, but those of a comedian sure of his crowd. He was in his dealings with concrete men, as in his dealings with the men in the mass, a charlatan of the very highest skill. And there was in him, it goes without saying, the persuasive charm of the charlatan, as well as the daring deviousness, the humanness of naivete, as well as the humanness of chicane. He knew how to woo, and not only boobs. The appearance of such men, of course, is inevitable under democracy. Consummate showmen, they arrest the wonder of the mob and so put its suspicions to sleep. What they actually believe is of secondary consequence. The main thing is what they say, even more the way they say it. Obviously, their activity does a great deal of damage to the democratic theory, for they are standing refutations of the primary doctrine that the common folk choose their leaders wisely. They damage it again in another and more subtle way. That is to say, their ineradicable contempt for the minds they must heat up and bamboozle leads them into a fatalism that shows itself in cynical and opportunistic politics, a deliberate avoidance of fundamentals. The policy of a democracy thus becomes an internal improvisation, changing with the private ambitions of its leaders and the transient and often unintelligible emotions of the rank and file. Roosevelt, incurably undemocratic in his habits of mind, often found it difficult to engage in those emotional oscillations. The fact explains his frequent loss of mob support, his periodical journeys into Coventry. There were times when his magnificent talents as a public comedian brought the proletariat to an almost unanimous groveling at his feet. But there were also times when he puzzled and dismayed it, and so awakened its hostility. I have a notion that he died too soon. His best days were probably not behind him, but ahead of him. Had he lived 10 years longer, he might have enjoyed a great rehabilitation and exchanged his old false leadership of the inflammatory and fickle mob for a sound and true leadership of the civilized minority. For the more one studies his mountebankeries as mob master, the more one is convinced that there was a shrewd man beneath the motley, and his actual beliefs were anything but nonsensical. The truth of them indeed emerges more clearly day by day. The old theory of a federation of free and autonomous states has broken down by its own weight, and we are moved towards centralization by forces that have long been powerful and are now quite irresistible. So, with the old theory of national isolation, it too has fallen to pieces. The United States can no longer hope to lead a separate life in the world, undisturbed by the pressure of foreign aspirations. Roosevelt, by whatever route of reflection and intuition, arrived at the sense of these facts at a time when it was still somewhat scandalous to state them, and it was the capital effort of his life to reconcile them in some dark way or other to the prevailing platitudes and so get them heeded. Today, no one seriously maintains, as all Americans once maintained, that the states can go on existing together as independent commonwealths, each of its own laws, its own legal theory, and its own view of the common constitutional bond. And today, no one seriously maintains that, as all Americans once maintained, that the nation may safely porter on without means of adequate defense. However unpleasant it may be to contemplate, the fact is plain that the American people, during the next century, will have to fight to maintain their place in the sun. Roosevelt lived just long enough to see his notions in these directions take on life, but not long enough to see them openly adopted. To the extent of his provision, he was a genuine leader of the nation, and perhaps in the years to come, when his actual ideas are disentangled from the demagogic fustian in which he had to wrap them, his more honest pronunciations will be given canonical honors, and he will be ranked among the prophets. He saw clearly, more than any other thing that was by no means obvious to his age. For example, the inevitability of frequent wars under the new world system of extreme nationalism. Again, the urgent necessity for primary police ends of organizing the backward nations into groups of vassals, each under the hoof of some first-rate power. Yet again, the probability of the breakdown of the old system of free competition. Once more, the high social utility of the Spartan virtues and the grave dangers of sloth and ease. Finally, the incompatibility of free speech and democracy. I do not say that he was always quite honest, even when he was most indubitably right, But insofar as it was possible for him to be honest and exist at all politically, he was inclined toward the straightforward thought and the candid word. That is to say, his instinct prompted him to tell the truth, just as the instinct of Wilson prompted him to shift and to simulate. What ailed him was the fact that his lust for glory, when it came to a struggle, was always vastly more powerful than his lust for the eternal verity. Tempted sufficiently, he would sacrifice anything and everything to get applause. Thus the statesman was debauched by the politician. The philosopher was elbowed out of sight by the popinjay. What he stood most clearly in opposition to was the superior pessimism of the three Adams brothers, the notion that the public problems of a democracy are unworthy the thought and effort of a civilized, respecting man, the same error that lies in wait for all of us who hold ourselves above the general. Against this suicidal aloofness, Roosevelt always hurled himself with brave effect. Enormously sensitive and resilient, almost pathological in his appetite for activity, he made it plain to everyone that the most stimulating sort of sport imaginable was obtained in fighting, not for mere money, but for ideas. There was no aristocratic reserve about him. He was not, in fact, an aristocrat at all, but a quite typical member of the upper bourgeoisie. The marks of the thoroughbred were simply not there. The man was blatant, crude, overly confidential, devious, tyrannical, vainglorious, sometimes quite childish. One often observed him in a certain pathetic wistfulness, a reaching out for a grand manner that was utterly beyond him. But the sweet went with the bitter. He had all the virtues of the fat and complacent burgher. His disdain of affectation and prudery was magnificent. He hated all pretension save his own pretension. He had a sound respect for hard effort, for loyalty, for thrift, for honest achievement. His worst defects were the defects of his race and time. Aspiring to be the leader of a nation of third-rate men, he had to stoop to the common level. When he struck out for realms above that level, he always came to grief. This was the unsafe Roosevelt, the Roosevelt who was laughed at, the Roosevelt who retired suddenly to cold storage. This was the Roosevelt who, in happier times, in a better place, might well have been. Well, one does what one can.
This is a brutal assessment.
Indeed. But not unempathetic.
No, and that was also something that was quite rare for Mencken, at least in his public writings. Also kind of surprising as well. But so for all of the dislike of the Prussians in particular from Mencken, he does still admire that there was an inclination towards a structured, non-democratic system. But as you can see, he strongly laments that Roosevelt prioritized the politically accessible above what was actually correct.
You see that sort of mirrored in Mencken, torn between his hatred of democracy and his hatred of centralization.
Yeah, right. So, and I don't want to keep beating a dead horse, but once again, this is, as you can tell by the sympathetic and tragic tone, this is very much a story of Mencken is writing a autopsy of a compromiser or someone who perhaps lied to himself or lied pragmatically. It's not a good story to have.
I wonder if we'll get the same empathy for Wilson.
I hope not.
Yeah, let's find out. This is The Archangel Woodrow, originally written 1921. Wilson was a typical Puritan, of the better sort, perhaps, for he at least toyed with the ambition to appear as a gentleman, but nevertheless a true Puritan. Magnanimity was simply beyond him. Confronted on his deathbed with the case of poor Debs, all his instincts compelled him to keep Debs in jail. I dare say that, as a purely logical matter, he saw clearly that the old fellow ought to be turned loose. Certainly, he must have known that Washington would not have hesitated, or Lincoln. But Calvinism triumphed as his intellectual faculties decayed. In the full bloom of health, with a plug hat on his head, he aped the gentry of his wistful adoration very cleverly, But lying in bed, stripped like Thackeray's Louis XIV, he reverted to his congenital Puritanism, which is to say, bounderism. There is a truly devastating picture of him in The Story of a Style by Dr. William Bayard Hale. Hale was peculiarly equipped for the business, for he was at one time high in the literary and philosophical confidence of the late Messiah, and learned to imitate his gaudy rhetoric with great skill, so perfectly indeed that he was delegated to write one of the Woodrowian books, to wit, The New Freedom, once a favorite text of New Republic liberals, deserving Democrats, and the tender-minded in general. But in the end, he revolted against both the new euphemism and its eminent pa, and when he wrote his book, he tackled both with considerable ferocity, and it must be added, vast effect. His analysis of the whole Wilsonian bunkum, in fact, is appallingly cruel. He shows its ideational hollowness, its ludicrous strutting and bombast, its heavy dependence upon greasy and meaningless words, its frequent descents to mere sound and fury, signifying nothing. In particular, he devotes himself to a merciless study of what, after all, must remain the deceased Moses' chief contribution to both history and beautiful letters vis-a-vis his biography of Washington. This incredible work is an almost inexhaustible mine of bad writing, faulty generalizing, childish pussyfooting, ludicrous posturing, and naive stupidity. One moment. To find a match for it, one must try to imagine a biography of the Duke of Wellington by his barber. Well, Hale spreads it out on his operating table, sharpens his snickersnee upon his bootleg, and proceeds to so harsh and anatomizing that it nearly makes me sympathize with the author. Not many of us, writers and hence vain and artificial fellows, could undergo so relentless an examination without damage. But not many of us, I believe, would suffer quite so horribly as Woodrow. The book is a mass of puerile affectations, and as Hale unveils one after another, he performs a sound service for American scholarship and American letters. I say that his book is cruel, but I must add that his laparotomies are carried on with every decorum, that he by no means rants and rages against his victim. On the contrary, he keeps his temper even when there is a strong temptation to lose it, and his inquiry maintains itself upon the literary level as much as possible without needless descents to political and personal matters. More than once, in fact, he says very kind things about Woodrow, a man probably quite as mellow and likable within as the next man, despite his strange incapacity for keeping his friends. The Woodrowian style, at the height of the Wilson hallucination, was much praised by corn-fed connoisseurs. I read editorials in those days comparing it to the style of the biblical prophets, and arguing that it vastly exceeded the manner of any living literatus. Looking back, it is not difficult to see how that doctrine arose. Its chief sponsors, first and last, were not men who actually knew anything about writing English, but simply editorial writers on party newspapers, i.e., men who related themselves to literary artists in much the same way that an Episcopal bishop relates himself to Paul of Tarsus. What intrigued such gentlemen was the plain fact that Wilson was their superior in their own special field, that he accomplished with a great deal more skill than they did themselves the great task of reducing all the difficulties of the hour to a few sonorous and unintelligible phrases, often with theological overtones. That he knew better than they did how to arrest and enchant the boobery with words that were simply words and nothing else. The vulgar like and respect that sort of balderdash. A discourse packed with valid ideas, accurately expressed, is quite incomprehensible to them. What they want is the sow of vague and comforting words cast into phrases made familiar to them by the whooping of their customary political and ecclesiastical rabble-rousers, and by the highfalutin style of the newspapers that they read. Woodrow knew how to conjure up such words. He knew how to make them glow and weep. He wasted no time upon the heads of his dupes, but aimed directly at their ears, diaphragms, and hearts. But reading his speeches in cold blood offers a curious experience. It is difficult to believe that even idiots ever succumbed to such transparent contradictions, to such gaudy processions of mere counterwords, to so vast and obvious a nonsensicality. Hale produces great sentence after sentence that has no apparent meaning at all. Stuff quite as bad as the worst bosh of Warren Gamaliel Harding. When Wilson got upon his legs in those days, he seems to have gone into a sort of trance with all the peculiar illusions and delusions that belong to a pedagogue gone mashuga. He heard words giving 3 cheers. He saw them race across a blackboard like Marxians pursued by the Polizzi. He felt them rush up and kiss him. The result was the grand series of moral and political, sociological, and theological maxims, which now lodges imperishably in the cultural heritage of the American people, along with Lincoln's government of the people, by the people, etc., Perry's "We have met the enemy and they are ours," and Vanderbilt's "The public be damned." The important thing is not that a popular orator should have uttered such vaporous and preposterous phrases, but that they should have been gravely received for weary years by a whole race of men, some of them intelligent. Here is a matter that deserves the sober inquiry of competent psychologists. The boobs took fire first, but after a while even college presidents, who certainly ought to be cynical men, if ladies of joy are cynical women, were sending up sparks, and for a long while anyone who laughed was in danger of a calaboose. So, this is not quite a piece-by-piece takedown that he has of Theodore Roosevelt, but he kind of explains why here. He doesn't think there's anything of substance to Wilson. If you read The New Freedom, it is very well written. It has some funny proposals, some hard-hitting analyses and whatnot else, but it should be admitted that there's very little of actual substance in there. Theodore Roosevelt, at the very least, was very direct in what he wanted to do and to who. The New Freedom is not quite so clear.
Nearly as much substance as the 14 points ended up having.
Right, and most of what Woodrow Wilson actually accomplished during his presidency, because of its vagary, ended up getting reinterpreted later. So,
yep.
So it goes.
That it does.
A much more biting critique, given that, the critique is such that there's nothing there to critique, which is perhaps the most brutal thing I've seen Mencken do to anyone yet.
Yes. Damning with faint criticism.
Right. Well, the last thing that we have on the docket, I believe, is Mr. Justice Holmes. Mr.
Indeed.
Quinn, you just read, but this might be of particular interest to you.
This is in my wheelhouse. Regular listeners to American Spirits will know that we covered Oliver Holmes's famous lecture, The Common Law, or at least one of them, about a month or so ago, 2 months ago now. So if you want to hear Mr. Holmes in his own words, go back and listen to that stream. But now we will see what Mr. Mencken makes of him. Mr. Justice Holmes, from the American Mercury, May 1930. Mr. Justice Holmes' dissenting opinions have got so much fawning praise from liberals that it is somewhat surprising to discover that Mr. Leaf is able to muster but 55 of them, and even more surprising to hear from Dr. Kirchway that in only one case did the learned justice stand quite alone, and that in the cases in which he has given expression to the judgment of the court, or in which he has concurred in the judgment, far outnumber the ratio of 8 to 1 or 8 to 10 to 1, those in which he felt it necessary to record his dissent. There is even more surprising stuff in the opinions themselves. In 3 Espionage Act cases, including the Debs case, one finds a clear statement of the doctrine that in wartime, the rights guaranteed by the First Amendment cease to have any substance and may be set aside summarily by any jury that has been sufficiently inflamed by a district attorney itching for a higher office. In Fox versus the State of Washington, we learn that any conduct, quote, which shall tend to encourage or advocate disrespect for the law, unquote, may be made a crime, and that the protest of a man who believes he has been jailed unjustly and threatens to boycott his persecutors may be treated as such a crime. In Moyers v. Peabody, it appears that the governor of a state, quote, without sufficient reason, but in good faith, unquote, may call out the militia, declare martial law, and jail anyone who he happens to suspect or dislike, without laying himself open to an action after he is out of office on the ground that he had no reasonable ground for his belief. And in Weaver versus Palmer Brothers, there was the plain inference that in order to punish a theoretical man, A, who is suspected of wrongdoing, the state legislature may lay a heavy and intolerable burdens upon a real man, B, who has admittedly done no wrong at all. I find it hard to reconcile any such notions with any plausible concept of liberalism. They may be good law, but it is impossible to see how they can conceivably promote liberty. My suspicion is that the hopeful liberals of the 20s, frantically eager to find at least one judge who was not violently and implacably against them, seized upon certain of Mr. Justice Holmes's opinions without examining the rest and read into them an attitude that was actually as foreign to his ways of thinking as it was to those of Chief Justice Hughes. Finding him now and then defending eloquently a new and uplifting law which his colleagues proposed to strike off the books, they concluded that he was a sworn advocate of the rights of man. But all the while, if I do not misread his plain words, he was actually no more than an advocate of the rights of lawmakers. There indeed is the clue to his whole jurisprudence. He believed that law-making bodies should be free to experiment almost ad libitum, that the courts should not call a halt upon them until they clearly passed the uttermost bounds of reason, that everything should be sacrificed to their autonomy, including apparently even the Bill of Rights. If this is liberalism, then all I can say is that liberalism is not what it was when I was young. In those remote days, sucking wisdom from the primeval springs, I was taught that the very aim of the Constitution was to keep lawmakers from running amok, and that it was the highest duty of the Supreme Court, following Marbury versus Madison, to safeguard it against their forays. It was not sufficient, so my instructors maintained, for Congress or a state legislature to give assurance that its intentions were noble. Noble or not, it had to keep squarely within the limits of the Bill of Rights. And the moment it went beyond them, its most virtuous acts were null and void. But Mr. Justice Holmes apparently thought otherwise. He held, it would seem, that violating the Bill of Rights is a rare and difficult business, possible only by summoning up deliberate malice, and that it is the chief business of the Supreme Court to keep the Constitution loose and elastic, so that blasting holes through it may not be too onerous. Bear this doctrine in mind, and you will have an adequate explanation, on the one hand, of those forward-looking opinions which console liberals, for example, in Lochner versus New York, the bakery case, in the child labor case, and in the Virginia case involving the compulsory sterilization of imbeciles, and on the other hand, of reactionary opinions, which they so politely overlook. For example, in the Debs case, in Bartels versus Iowa, a wartime case involving the prohibition of foreign language teaching. In the Mann Act case, in which Dr. Holmes concurred with the majority of the court and thereby helped pave the way for the wholesale blackmail which Mr. Justice McKenna, who dissented, and warned against. And finally, in the long line of Volstead Act cases. Like any other man, of course, a judge sometimes permits himself the luxury of inconsistency. Mr. Justice Holmes, it seems, did it so in the wiretapping case, and again in Abrams' case, in which his dissenting opinions was clearly at variance with the prevailing opinion of the Debs case written by him. But I think it is quite fair to say that this fundamental attitude was precisely as I have stated it. Over and over again in these opinions, he advocated giving the legislature full headroom, and over again he protested against using the 14th Amendment to upset novel and oppressive laws aimed, frankly, at helpless minorities. If what he said and some of those opinions were accepted literally, there would scarcely be any break at all upon lawmaking, and the Bill of Rights would have no more significance than the Code of Manu. The weak spot in his reasoning, if I may presume to suggest such a thing, was his tacit assumption that the voice of the legislature was the voice of the people. There is, in fact, no reason for confusing the people and the legislature. The two, in these later years, are quite distinct. The legislature, like the executive, has ceased, save indirectly, to even be the creature of the people. It is the creature, in the main, of pressure groups, and most of them, it must be manifest, are of dubious wisdom and even more dubious honesty. Laws are no longer made by a rational process of public discussion. They are made by a process of blackmail and intimidation, and they are executed in the same manner. A typical lawmaker today is a man wholly devoid of principle, a mere counter in a grotesque and knavish game. If the right pressure could be applied to him, he would cheerfully vote in favor of polygamy, astrology, and cannibalism. It is the aim of the Bill of Rights, if it has any remaining aim at all, to curb such prehensile gentry. Its function is to set a limitation upon their power, to harry and oppress us for their own private profit. The fathers, in framing it, did not have powerful minorities in mind. What they sought to hobble was simply the majority. But that is a detail. The important thing is that the Bill of Rights sets forth, in the plainest of plain language, limits beyond which even legislatures may not go. The Supreme Court in Marbury versus Madison decided that it was bound to execute that intent, and for 100 years that doctrine remained the cornerstone of American constitutional law. But in late years, the court has taken the opposite line, and the public opinion seems to support it. Certainly Dr. Holmes did not go as far in that direction as some of his brother judges, but certainly equally he went far enough. To call him a liberal is to make the word meaningless. Let us for a moment stop thinking of him as one, and let us also stop thinking of him as a litterateur, a reformer, a sociologist, a prophet, an evangelist, a metaphysician. Instead, let us think of him as something that he undoubtedly was in his Pleistocene youth, and probably remained ever after, to wit, a soldier. Let us think of him further as a soldier extraordinarily ruminative and articulate. In fact, so ruminative and articulate as to be, in the military caste, almost miraculous. And let us think of him still further as a soldier whose natural distaste and contempt for civilians and corollary yearning to heave them all into hell was cooled and eased by the stream of blood that once flowed through the autocrat of the breakfast table. In brief, as a soldier beset by occasional doubts, hesitations, flashes of humor, bursts of affability, moments of sneaking pity. Observe that I insert the wary word occasional. It surely belongs there. On at least 3 days out of 4 during his long years on the bench, the learned justice remained the soldier, precise, pedantic, unimaginative, even harsh. But on the 4th day, a strange amiability overcame him, and a strange impulse to play with heresy, and it was on that 4th day that he acquired his singular repute as a sage. There is no evidence in Dr. Holmes' decisions that he ever gave any really profound thought to ideas which raged in his time. He was interested in those ideas more or less, and now and then, as his high office forced him to take a hand in the battle, but never did so with anything properly describable as passionate conviction. The whole uproar, one gathers, seemed fundamentally foolish to him. Did he have any genuine belief in democracy? Apparently, the answer must be no. It amused him as a spectacle, and there were times when he was in the mood to let the spectacle run on, and even to help it on. But there were other times when he was moved to haul it up with a sharp command. No doubt that is why his decisions show so wide a spread and so beautiful an inconsistency, baffling to those who would get him into a bottle. He would, on occasion, state the case for the widest freedom, whether of the individual citizen or of the representative lawmaker, with a magnificent clarity. But he could also, on occasion, give his vote to the most brutal sort of repression. It seems to me that the latter occasions were rather more numerous than the former. And it seems to me again that a very attentive reading of his decisions that what moved him when he was disposed to be complacent was far less a positive love of liberty than an amiable and half contemptuous feeling that those who longed for it ought to get a horse doctor's dose of it, and thereby suffer a really first-rate bellyache. This easygoing cynicism of his is what gave his decisions their peculiar salacity and made them interesting as literature. It has separated them sharply from the writings of his fellow judges, most of whom were frankly dull dogs. He had a considerable talent for epigram, and like any other man who possesses it, he was not shy about exercising it. I do not go so far as to allege that it colored and conditioned his judgment, that the apt phrase actually seduced him, but it certainly must be plain that once his mood had brought him to this or that judgment, the announcement of it was sometimes more than a little affected by purely literary impulses. Now and then, alas, the result was far more literature than law. I point, for example, to one of his most celebrated epigrams, quote, "Three generations of morons are enough," unquote. It is a memorable saying, and its essential soundness need not be questioned. But is it really judicial or even legal in form and content? Does it offer plain guidance, which higher courts are supposed to provide? What of two generations? Are they too little? I should not want to be nisi prius judge if all the pronunciamentios of the Supreme Court were so charmingly succinct and memorable and so vague. The average American judge, as everyone knows, is a mere rabbinical automaton, with no more give and take in his mind than you will find in the mind of a terrier watching a rat hole. He converts the law into a series of rubber stamps and brings them down upon the scalped sculps of the just and unjust alike. The alternative to him is as commonly conceived, is quite as bad, an uplifter of a black robe, eagerly gulping every new brand of Peruna that comes out and converting his pulpit into a sort of soapbox. Mr. Justice Holmes was neither, and he was better than either. He was under no illusions about the law. He knew very well that its aim was not to bring in the millennium, but to simply keep the peace. But he believed that keeping the peace was an art that could be practiced in various ways, and that if one of them was by using a club, then another was by employing a feather. Thus, the liberals, who long for tickling with a great and tragic longing, were occasionally lifted to the heights of ecstasy by the learned judge's operations, and in fact soared so high that they were out of earshot of the next day's thwack of the club. I suspect that Dr. Holmes himself, when he heard of their enthusiasm, was quite as much amused as flattered. Such misunderstandings are naturally grateful to a skeptic, and they are doubly grateful to a skeptic of the military order, with his professional doubt of all persons who think that they think. I can imagine this skepticism, or, if you choose, cynicism, giving great aid and comfort to him on January 1st, 1932, when he entered the chamber of the Supreme Court for the last time and read his last opinion. The case was one of James Dunn, a humble bootician of Eureka, California, and the retiring justice delivered the majority opinion. Dunn had been tried in California on an indictment embracing 3 counts. First, charged him with keeping liquor for sale. Second, with possessing it unlawfully. And third, with selling it. The jury acquitted him on the second and third counts, but found him guilty on the first. His counsel thereupon appealed. The evidence as to all 3 offenses, it was shown, was precisely the same. If the prisoner was innocent of 2 of them, how could he be guilty of the third? Mr. Justice Holmes, speaking for himself and his fellow justice, save one, swept away the question with the following words, quote, "Consistency in the verdict is not necessary. Each count in an indictment is regarded as a separate offense. If the separate indictments had been presented to the defendant for possession and maintenance of a nuisance, and had been separately tried, the same evidence being offered in support of each, an acquittal could not be pled as res judicata of the other. Where the offenses are separately charged, the accounts of a single indictment and the same rule must hold." I am not learned in the law, but the special gifts of a lawyer are surely not necessary to see that this judgment disposed completely of the prohibition on double jeopardy in Article 1 of the Bill of Rights. And what is said in plain English is that a man may be tried over and over again for what is essentially the same offense, that if 1, 2, or 3 or n juries acquit him, he may yet still be kept in the dock, and so on ad infinitum, until a jury is found that will convict him. What such a series of juries do may be done by one single jury by the simple device of splitting his one offense into 2, 3, 4, or n offenses, and then trying him for all of them. In order to go free, he must win verdicts of not guilty on every count. But in order to go to jail, all the prosecuting attorney needs to do is a verdict of guilty on one. I commend this decision to the Liberals, who still cherish the delusion that Holmes belonged to their lodge. Let them paste it in their Sunday go-to meeting hats. And I commend them to also the astounding but charming fact that the one judge who dissented was Judge Pierce Butler, for many years the chief demon in their menagerie. This is what he said, quote, excluding the possession negatived by the finding under the second account, there is nothing of substance left in the first count, for its specifications were limited to the keeping for sale of the identical drinks alleged in the second count to have been unlawfully possessed. The evidence having been found insufficient to establish such a possession, it cannot be held adequate to warrant conviction under the first count. The finding of not guilty is a final determination that possession, the gravamen of both counts, is not proved. So yes, and the postscript of this, of course, is that in the modern day, when prosecutors want to convict you of a crime, they will charge you with 20, 30, or 40 separate counts of different crimes in order that even if you beat 39 of the 40, the one will still send you to jail.
I was about to say, I too am not learned in the law, but this seems very familiar to how, like, political persecution happens in the modern day.
Indeed, it's been utterly weaponized.
Yeah, so I appreciate that. Just on a quality note of Mencken himself, he's able to comment on the law without making a fool of himself. It's a rare quality to do that, as he says, someone not learned in the law.
Yeah.
I also can't help but detect a certain prescience that he knew how this would get weaponized against people. That seems to be the tone he ends this section with. So, I would like to point out something very fascinating. He spends most of this article trying to point out that that Holmes is not a liberal. He's not in the liberal camp truly, and that he's actually trying to defend this term from Holmes's association to it.
Mm-hmm.
He leaves this implicit, but if Holmes is not a liberal, he must be a conservative along the same ranks as Roosevelt, Bismarck, and all these other people who Mencken the dislike. I hope in the modern day, it's not so easy to confuse this as good and bad, liberal bad, conservative good, or vice versa. It's quite fascinating that we have a very strong lineage in American thought being against this conservatism. And if you look at what the conservatives were associated with, these Bismarckian types, these very authoritarian centralizers, their innovations that we're left with in the law and government, most of these anti-conservative screeds from the 20s, 30s, 40s, and what have you, seem to have lived up very well. They have not served us on our side in the modern day well at all.
No. Binary thinking is ever the rock upon which we founder.
Yeah, and I, of course, am biased on this because I have an article on the Old Glory Club Substack specifically on rejecting conservatism. So if you want to know the spirit that that's written in, it's sort of in a strong dislike of conservatism that Mencken has here is something, at least as it's expressed in American politics, is short-sighted, expedient, destructive in the long term. It's not to mention the other sides, which of course can do the same things, but it's certainly very obvious here. So, Mr. Quinn, I see that you did write down, I think at the end of last week, men on benches. Was that a personal note, or did you want to...
Oh, yeah, that was just a note from me for a speech I am writing. I want to be able to refer back to that, and that was the most convenient place to put the note. Yeah.
All right. Well, in that case, that's all I have from Mencken's Christomathy. We've been here for a month now, I suppose.
A month of Mencken.
Yes. This is probably one of the best books that I have in my library. I find
Surely the second best book that you have in your library.
way.
Well, I do say we'd be well served if more people would take seriously what Mencken has written about, well, about the state of the American nation at his time, which reflects virtually identically our time. And it is not a very good looking reflection, let me tell you that.
Mm.
Yeah, if I could, at the end of his Chrestomathy, he has two very short selections in the appendix. One's called Catechism, and the other one is called the Epitaph. His catechism says, question, if you find so much that is unworthy of reverence in the United States, then why do you live here? And his answer is, why do men go to zoos? So, sums up the sort of ugly picture that he sees of the United States at the time that you're talking about. And I think that that's very important. It's very easy. Actually, I'll make 2 points of this. It's very easy for a lot of right-wingers to discard criticisms of their country, ethnicity, nationality, what have you, as subversive, deconstructive, assaults, and what have you. But that, as you can see with the online right today, compare it to, say, 6 or 7 years ago, discarding all of those criticisms very quickly turns into a sort of unfounded and unreal belief in something that doesn't exist.
Mm.
And then the other thing is, because all of those deconstructions, criticisms, and whatnot are so affiliated with like a certain political faction, it adds a political connotation. So now, not only is this pattern happening, these people are creating a false view of what is around their ethnicity, nationality, and what have you. They also refuse to even see any of the criticisms, because to do so would be political surrender in their minds.
Mm.
So it's a very dangerous way to go if you can't imbibe some criticism.
Indeed.
So
You have to
just
read
to-
the epitaph.
yeah, I was about to say, just to end the epitaph, if after I depart this vale you ever remember me and have thought to please my ghost, forgive some sinner and wink your eye at some homely girl. So I think that's a perfect way to end this, the tone that you should take this all in.
Mm.
Very
That's all I
good. Well,
have.
we do have one super chat from Adrian Shepard 378. With the New Deal, you win. Well,
That certainly is not the case.
That's a
I
very
think that
good.
might have been. What was
go
that, Charlemagne?
Go ahead, Ryan.
I was just going to say, I think that was sent in around the time we were talking about Roosevelt 1.
Correct.
Yep.
Yes.
So, yeah, that's I think a very good analogy.
Yes, of course he's, making an analogy to Roosevelt 2 there with a little more of an in joke, and yeah, it's well taken. So with that, we're done the Mencken arc. Let's see, do we have anything on Entropy? No. So it looks like Mr. D started a space, so I will release us so that can be enjoyed by anyone seeking to listen or join, including myself.